She was flawless on film, until the camera stopped rolling. Behind Hollywood's golden glow was a silent epidemic. Spines curved in pain, minds fractured in silence, bodies stitched together by studios desperate to sell perfection. These weren't just starlets. They were women sculpted by suffering and hidden behind satin. You think you know them, but you've only seen the polished frame. Tonight we unspool what the credits never showed. This is 25 Golden Age Hollywood actresses with secret disabilities and deformities, where beauty was the disguise and the body kept the truth. Before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed. These are the stories they never taught in film class, and there's plenty more where this came from. Drop a comment with where you're tuning in from and what time it is right now. Midnight? 3 a.m.? Either way, you're not alone. Let's get back to the shadows. 1. Judy Garland. She was MGM's pocket-sized miracle, their perky little powerhouse in ruby slippers. But behind the Technicolor dream, Judy Garland's body was betraying her. From childhood, she suffered from scoliosis, a curved spine that bent her posture and left her in chronic pain. Executives didn't want to see that, of course. They wanted a star. So they capped her teeth, strapped her torso, stuffed her nose with rubber to reshape it, and told her, repeatedly, that she was ugly. Little Hunchback, they called her behind closed doors. A backhanded nickname whispered between studio heads with cigars and contracts. To them, she was a product, not a person. Judy's spinal condition was never mentioned in interviews. The marketing machine painted her as eternally cheerful, forever Dorothy, forever 16. But the mirror didn't lie. Neither did the pain. The studios handed her amphetamines to keep her thin and energetic, then barbiturates to help her sleep. She became both unstoppable and collapsing at the same time, buoyed by applause but drowning off stage. Her spine ached, but the show went on. It always went on. And as she smiled through the pain, through disfigurement, through pills and pressure and the twisted curve of her body, the myth of effortless stardom took root. It would take down more than just Judy, because perfection, as it turns out, was contagious and deeply terminal. Just ask the next girl, the one they called perfect from birth, who broke her back before she even turned 13. 2. Elizabeth Taylor. Elizabeth Taylor was born with violet eyes, double eyelashes, and congenital scoliosis. God was showing off, and also taking notes. Because for every anatomical gift, there was a private tax. The curvature in her spine would follow her all her life, an invisible line through her famously opulent figure. She broke her back as a teenager filming National Velvet, the kind of injury that ends careers. But instead of recovery, she was pushed back into work. More roles, more pain. Decades of hospitalizations followed. She endured more than 40 major surgeries, including spinal operations that required weeks in traction. But you wouldn't know it from the magazine spreads. Elizabeth Taylor wasn't just beautiful, she was the beauty standard. She was diamonds and scandal and husbands, never hospital gowns or orthopedic braces. Publicly, she was radiant. Privately, she was held together with steel rods and morphine. Chronic pain reshaped her life behind the scenes. She became known for mood swings, for diva behavior. But it's easier to call a woman difficult than admit she's suffering in silence. Pain is invisible. Glamour is not. And Elizabeth knew exactly which one sold more tickets. Her medical chart reads like a war diary, but she kept returning to the front line, because the show, once again, demanded it. And the audience, as always, believed the illusion. Of course, no illusion lasts forever, especially when the body begins to rebel not with a curve but with a deep internal fire, one that tears through organs, fertility, and any hope of peace. 2 stories in, and already the glamour's starting to crack. If you're still with us, hit that subscribe button. There's a whole underworld of forgotten truths waiting just below the silver screen. Tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, And what time is it right now? Because somehow, these stories always hit different in the dark. 3. Marilyn Monroe. They sold her like a candle in the wind, but the flame wasn't what destroyed her. It was the storm underneath. Marilyn Monroe was the most desired woman in America, but her body was a constant betrayal. While photographers captured her from her best angles, underneath the glitz, she lived with a chronic, invisible pain, endometriosis, a disease that riddled her reproductive system and left her in agonizing cycles of illness, inflammation, and grief. Behind every studio smile was another hospital visit, another miscarriage, another day of painkillers just to walk straight in heels. She was fragile in a way the public wasn't allowed to see. Voluptuous, they called her. Curvy. But what they didn't say was that she often couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't stand without discomfort. The bloating, the nausea, the knife-like cramps, they weren't camera-friendly. And like so many actresses of her time, her suffering was explained away as emotional instability. Hysteria, moodiness, whatever word was safest for an industry that feared women's pain more than it feared bad press. Studio contracts didn't include room for chronic illness. Her vulnerability was packaged as mystery. Her mental health struggles became tabloid fodder. Her physical agony was buried under silk gowns and red lipstick. But the body keeps score. And Marilyn's wasn't built to be a bombshell forever, because even a sex symbol has a nervous system, and hers was screaming. And if Marilyn was the fire, the next woman was the storm, all bright eyes, British beauty, and a darkness the world refused to understand. 4. Vivien Leigh. She played Scarlett O'Hara like she was the Civil War, passionate, defiant, and somehow always smoldering in ashes. But Vivien Leigh was fighting battles that didn't end when the camera cut. Her performances were surgical in their precision, yet emotionally radioactive. Underneath the precision was a diagnosis that didn't officially exist in polite society: bipolar disorder. In her 20s, doctors called it manic depression. Colleagues called it temperamental. Her lovers called it something else entirely. One minute she was electric, charming entire rooms, working without sleep, rehearsing lines into the dawn. The next, she'd collapse into paralyzing gloom, plagued by voices, shadows, and the weight of 1,000 imagined failures. She also suffered recurrent bouts of tuberculosis, a disease that left her physically drained and emotionally unmoored. She coughed blood between performances. She hallucinated between takes. Still, producers kept her working. Audiences demanded her beauty, not her boundaries. She was called a genius. She was called a nightmare. Sometimes on the same day. Laurence Olivier, her husband, once described her as more tragic than any actress I have ever known. Not because of her roles, but because no stage could contain her real chaos. Vivien's life was edited for public consumption, just like her films. But the outtakes, those messy, manic, shivering episodes, never made it to the big screen. And yet, even at her lowest, she kept performing. Because in Hollywood, the spotlight isn't just a dream, it's camouflage. The next star knew all about that. She smiled for the camera while her mind unraveled under the weight of memory, trauma, and electric therapy. 5. Jean Tierney. Jean Tierney had the kind of face that made directors speak in cathedral whispers: sharp cheekbones, tragic eyes, a geometry that seemed almost mathematically precise. But beneath that beautiful symmetry was a fracture the public never saw, her mind slipping in and out of its own narrative. Tierney lived with severe bipolar disorder, though at the time it went by gentler, more accusatory names: nervous exhaustion, female instability, emotional trouble. Anything but the truth. Her life unraveled quietly at first: shifts in mood, bouts of sleeplessness, periods where she could barely rise from bed. Hollywood simply told her to try harder. The industry didn't have language for mental illness, only excuses. If she smiled on cue, she was fine. If she didn't, she was difficult. Then came the deeper spiral. Tierney underwent electroshock treatment so severe and repetitive that she later said they hollowed out pieces of her memory. Conversations, faces, entire scenes from her life evaporated like mist. She tried to return to the screen, but the camera isn't kind to someone who's been turned inside out. Still, she kept her tragedies mostly to herself. She moved through sets like a ghost, calm, composed, intellectually present but emotionally distant, carrying a quiet grief that shaped every line she spoke. Hollywood adored her beauty but never understood her pain. And if Jean's mind betrayed her, the next woman's mind didn't just falter, it vanished in slow, devastating increments, while the world mistook the symptoms for scandal. 6. Rita Hayworth. Rita Hayworth was the original screen siren. Red hair, impossible poise, and a dance partner who could make gravity jealous. But in her 40s, something began to shift. Lines she once delivered with liquid ease slipped away. Choreography she'd mastered decades earlier suddenly felt foreign. People whispered that she was unreliable, moody, self-indulgent. They blamed temper. They blamed alcohol. They blamed anything except the truth. Rita Hayworth was developing early-onset Alzheimer's disease, decades before almost anyone understood what that meant. For years she walked into scenes without remembering her marks, forgot friends she'd known for decades, misplaced objects, then entire days. Directors grew frustrated, colleagues grew wary. Hollywood didn't have the vocabulary for cognitive decline. They just knew their golden girl was acting strange. No one saw the fear building behind her glamorous mask. Imagine being Rita. The camera is rolling, the lights are hot, and suddenly your mind goes blank like someone has wiped the slate clean. Instead of empathy, she received tabloid mockery. Instead of help, she got blame. It wasn't until 1980, after years of confusion, public withdrawal, and private heartbreak, that doctors finally named what had been happening. By then, the damage was irreversible. But the revelation reframed her entire final act. She hadn't been fading in relevance. She'd been fading in memory. And if Rita's disappearance was internal and invisible, the next actress's downfall was witnessed in real time. Twisted by rumor, misunderstood by studios, and defined by a mind that the world preferred to sensationalize instead of understand. 7. Frances Farmer. Frances Farmer was the kind of star Hollywood didn't know how to market. Brilliant, rebellious, and disobedient to the image machine. She had opinions. She refused press stunts. She wouldn't smile on cue. That alone was enough to brand her unmanageable. But what was dismissed as arrogance was, in truth, the outer edge of something much deeper. A mind at war with itself. Farmer showed early signs of serious mental illness, possibly schizophrenia, possibly a misdiagnosed mood disorder, though back then the diagnoses were as crude as the treatments. She oscillated between sharp lucidity and complete disassociation. One day she would deliver a performance that shattered the room, and the next she might vanish into silence or fury. Directors labeled her unstable. Studios retaliated by shelving her roles and rewriting her as a cautionary tale. The more she resisted the studio system, the more it retaliated, and the more her condition worsened. She was institutionalized repeatedly, her name dragged through tabloid headlines that twisted her into the archetype of the mad woman in Hollywood. For years, truth and fiction about her were tangled into a narrative of moral failure. Few cared to look deeper. But Frances Farmer wasn't alone in being turned into a symbol. The next actress? She was transformed into a flapper icon while her real unraveling self was buried under sequins, smiles, and a silence no one wanted to decode. 8. Clara Bow. Before Monroe. Before Garland. There was Clara Bow, the original It Girl. She didn't just define the Roaring Twenties. She was the Roaring Twenties, wide-eyed, reckless, untouchable. At least that's what the screen showed. What it didn't show was the wreckage behind her carefully painted charisma. Clara grew up in chaos, poverty, trauma, a family history riddled with instability. But when the camera started rolling, she lit up with an energy no director could explain. Her on-screen presence was electric, pure instinct, pure id. Yet off-screen, she was barely holding on. Her anxiety was severe and constant. She suffered breakdowns that were blamed on vanity, or worse, on moral weakness. Studio executives saw a live wire and tried to bottle it, then punished her when it sparked. She collapsed more than once from exhaustion. She heard voices. She feared crowds. Rumors circulated, some cruel, some absurd, few grounded in reality. But Hollywood isn't known for nuance, so they chewed through her fame, then spat her out as unstable, washed up, hysterical. The same traits that had made her a star, emotional intensity, vulnerability, raw expression, were now labeled liabilities. She left the screen early, retreating into obscurity. And while Clara's flame burned fast, the next woman let hers dim by choice. An icon who turned inward, vanishing not in madness but in deep, deliberate solitude. 9. Greta Garbo. Greta Garbo didn't just act, she haunted. Her performances were soft storms, smoldering with unspoken grief. But off-screen, Garbo's mystique was more than branding. It was protection. She famously declared she wanted to be alone. The world believed it was eccentricity. It was actually survival. Garbo lived with deep depression. The signs were there all along, tucked between her absences and sudden withdrawals. Her reluctance to engage with press or fame, her long silences that everyone called mysterious. In reality, Garbo walked a tightrope between visibility and collapse. Her letters, careful, aching, and often contradictory, hint at a woman trapped in her own mind, unable to explain the heaviness that never seemed to lift. She turned down parties, roles, entire careers. Not out of arrogance, but out of fatigue, emotional exhaustion. A need to protect herself from the consuming machinery of fame. When she retired at 35, people assumed she was being dramatic, but Garbo was retreating from the world to stay intact. She walked the streets of New York like a ghost in sunglasses, forever observed, forever avoiding. Hollywood loves a tragic woman, but it doesn't know what to do with one who quietly refuses to fall apart on cue. Garbo didn't self-destruct, she faded by design. But some women didn't get to retreat. Some had no veil of mystery, only pressure, history, and a world determined to watch them unravel in real time. 10. Dorothy Dandridge. Dorothy Dandridge was everything Hollywood said it wanted: talented, beautiful, charismatic. But she was also black, which meant the rules changed. She broke barriers and was punished for it. She became the first African-American woman nominated for Best Actress, and afterward found herself boxed in, miscast, and left to wait for roles that never came. Behind the accolades was a woman under siege, financially, emotionally, physically. Dandridge lived with depression, the kind that simmers beneath polished surfaces. Her career stalled just as she was expected to shine. Studios gave her crumbs, then blamed her when she couldn't feast. Her personal life frayed as fast as her professional one. A marriage that left scars, a child born with severe developmental disabilities, and a cascade of financial mismanagement that left her barely afloat. The glamour stayed on the posters. The fear stayed behind closed doors. She relied on barbiturates to keep herself going, not for pleasure, for survival. When the industry turned its back, the pills remained. As the cameras stopped rolling, the silence got louder. Her death came far too early, but by then she'd already been erased in slow motion. The system that once propped her up couldn't, or wouldn't, recognize her pain. And the next woman? She didn't fade away in scandal or solitude. She vanished between takes, hidden in plain sight by a smile too perfect to be real. 11. Jean Arthur. Jean Arthur had the kind of voice that stuck in your memory, half silk, half nervous laughter. She lit up comedies with a jittery brilliance that made audiences feel like they'd stumbled onto something private. But what played as charm on screen was, in real life, sheer panic. Jean Arthur suffered from debilitating stage fright and a tangle of psychosomatic symptoms that turned even simple public appearances into ordeals. Behind the scenes, directors learned to work around her anxiety. She would vomit before takes, tremble between scenes, and frequently retreat to her dressing room for long stretches of silence. And yet, when the camera rolled, she snapped into clarity. No missed lines, no cracks in her timing. Just a seamless performance, delivered with surgical precision. It wasn't just fear of performing. It was deeper, an anxiety that saturated her entire sense of self. Crowds terrified her. Press tours were near impossible. She refused interviews, skipped premieres, and frequently clashed with studios who couldn't understand why one of their most bankable stars had to be practically dragged onto sound stages. She walked away from Hollywood when most actresses were still chasing parts. But Jean wasn't running from failure. She was running from the noise, the pressure, the spotlight that never softened. And while her nerves pulled her inward, the next woman faced a different kind of silence. One measured not in panic but in the gradual muffling of the world itself. 12. Margaret Sullivan. Margaret Sullivan's voice was unmistakable, husky, poetic, tinged with a kind of restrained melancholy. But what audiences didn't hear was the creeping silence that stalked her entire career. Sullivan suffered from otosclerosis, a degenerative condition that causes gradual hearing loss. As the years passed, sound slipped away from her like a receding tide. In early films, she compensated by studying lip movements and blocking scenes in a way that let her anticipate dialogue. But as the condition worsened, panic set in. Missing a cue wasn't just embarrassing, it was terrifying. In a medium built on timing and delivery, going deaf was a professional death sentence. She kept it hidden as long as she could. The studio never announced her condition, and her colleagues often had no idea she was struggling to hear them. But the signs were there. A sudden stiffness in her performances, subtle delays in dialogue, and emotional exhaustion that settled in her bones. Margaret began suffering from insomnia, anxiety, and mood swings that doctors treated as isolated issues. They weren't. They were symptoms of a woman trying to perform through the fog, trying to pretend the world still sounded the same. And when the silence became too loud to ignore, she stepped back. Not with a scandal or a breakdown, but with quiet, exhausted retreat. The next woman didn't have the luxury of stepping away. Her pain came from the physical toll of strength itself. Every punch, every stunt, every fall collected quietly in her bones. 13. Barbara Stanwyck. Barbara Stanwyck didn't play strong women, she invented them. In heels, in slacks, with a cigarette clenched between her teeth and a stare that could shatter steel. What most fans didn't realize was that she earned every ounce of that grit the hard way. Stanwyck was one of the few actresses who routinely did her own stunts, often in heels, often without complaint, and always without body doubles. On paper, it looked like dedication. In reality, it was silent damage. Over the course of her long career, she racked up injuries, cracked ribs, torn ligaments, and a serious back injury that left her with chronic pain well into her later years. But no one knew. She kept filming. She kept moving. Pain was background noise. It had to be. In a town where weakness could end a career overnight, Barbara's answer was always to get tougher. And the more she pushed through it, the more Hollywood rewarded her. A starlet in her 20s, a powerhouse in her 50s, a legend by the time her spine had paid its final dues. Her later interviews were cryptic, but the wear was visible. She moved slower, stood stiffer, but she never let it define her. Because in Hollywood, you weren't allowed to be in pain. You were only allowed to be resilient. And the woman who came next? She knew resilience too, but hers was forged in the aftermath of paralysis, hidden behind a stare that dared anyone to notice what she'd lost. 14. Bette Davis. Bette Davis never blinked, figuratively or literally. Her gaze became iconic, almost mythic, a weaponized stare that could rip through a room. But what most never saw was how hard she fought to keep that stare steady in the face of a body slowly giving out. In her later years, Davis suffered a stroke that partially paralyzed her face and left her with limited control over the right side of her body. She also underwent a mastectomy after a breast cancer diagnosis. It should have ended her career. It didn't. She refused to stop working, refused to surrender that electric screen presence, even as her speech slurred and her walk stiffened. Her face, the very tool that had built her stardom, was no longer symmetrical. Her voice, once razor-sharp, grew raspy and uneven. But the fire, still there, the spine, still unbreakable. She took roles that didn't hide her condition, didn't beg for pity. She simply was, defiant, sharp, and entirely uninterested in being softened by sympathy. She once said, "Old age ain't no place for sissies," and she meant it. She wore her scars the way other stars wore diamonds, without apology. The disability didn't make her tragic. It made her terrifyingly human. And just beneath the sophistication and sparkle of the next star, another human story brewed, one of swollen joints, hidden pain, and the slow, elegant decline that no costume could quite conceal. 15. Rosalind Russell. Rosalind Russell specialized in the fast-talking, sharp-thinking woman, the one with a punchline always loaded and ready. She was the blueprint for screwball sophistication. What audiences didn't see beneath the tailored suits and mile-a-minute banter was a body steadily betraying her. Russell lived with rheumatoid arthritis, a chronic autoimmune disease that inflames the joints and slowly wears them down from the inside out. She kept the diagnosis quiet. Pain, in Hollywood, was private currency. Instead, she had her costumes tailored to disguise swelling. She used controlled movements, limited choreography, and intense discipline to maintain the illusion of ease. Her signature roles in the 40s and 50s demanded lightning-fast timing, but off-screen, her body was slowing down. The arthritis wasn't the only challenge. Russell also suffered from periods of nervous exhaustion and what she called collapses, likely triggered by the invisible toll of chronic illness. But none of it made the press. Publicly, she was radiant. Privately, she was managing pain, fatigue, and emotional burnout with the precision of a general. She kept acting well into her later years, long after others had faded. But the glitz grew heavier to carry. Behind the sparkle was steel, and behind the steel, swollen joints, restless nights, and a quiet resilience no script could teach. And while Rosalind danced around her pain, the next actress had no such luxury. Her pain had once paralyzed her completely, and yet, somehow she still danced. 16. Sid Charisse. Sid Charisse's legs were insured for $1 million, a headline made to sell fantasies. What didn't make the headlines? One of those legs had been partially paralyzed by polio when she was a child. The illness left her with one limb thinner, weaker, and visibly different from the other. Doctors advised ballet as rehabilitation, never imagining it would become her calling card. Charisse trained with obsessive rigor, rebuilding strength inch by inch. Not to become a dancer initially, but to walk again. That she would one day fly across sound stages with Gene Kelly and Fred Astaire was something of a cosmic punchline. She mastered camera angles, costuming, and choreography that disguised her limitations. Directors knew which leg to light. Editors knew which takes to keep. The public saw elegance, perfection in motion. What they didn't see was the physical toll of keeping the illusion intact. Every performance was an act of defiance against her own childhood prognosis. She rarely spoke of her early illness, preferring instead to let her movement speak for her. But those who worked with her knew. Her control was absolute not by nature but by necessity. And if Sid Charisse danced her way out of paralysis, the next woman fought through it with a pen in her hand and a camera at her back. directing, acting, and rewriting the rules even as her body quietly bore the weight of an invisible war. 17. Ida Lupino. Ida Lupino wasn't just a star. She was one of the first women to sit behind the camera and command it. Actress, writer, director, producer. In a male-dominated system, she carved out space with sheer grit and a stare that said, "Don't bother underestimating me." But behind that hard-boiled confidence was a body still marked by something most of her colleagues never knew: polio. At just 16, Lupino was struck by the virus during a time when polio meant one thing: immobility. She survived, but it left her partially paralyzed for a time and with lingering weakness in one leg for the rest of her life. She was told she might never walk properly again, let alone act. She did both anyway. Her recovery was brutal and never total. She carried fatigue like luggage, always there, just off camera. She worked long hours not because it was easy, but because she didn't know how to stop. Her disability wasn't visible in the glamorous portraits or hard-edged roles, but it shaped her behind the scenes. As a director, she often chose stories about outsiders, people judged or broken, survivors navigating systems that didn't understand them. Sound familiar? Ida turned her pain into perspective. She refused to be pitied. She preferred to be in charge. And while Ida worked behind the lens to control her story, the next woman danced through hers with so much speed and sparkle that you'd never guess her career was built atop a condition that once made walking nearly impossible. 18. Ann Miller. Ann Miller tapped faster than anyone in Hollywood, literally. She was known for hammering out 500 taps per minute, a blur of legs, sequins, and unstoppable rhythm. But what audiences didn't know was that she started dancing not for fame, but for function. As a child, Miller was diagnosed with rickets, a disease caused by vitamin D deficiency that softened her bones and left her legs severely bowed. Doctors told her she might not walk normally again. Her mother, undeterred, enrolled her in dance classes. Tap wasn't just a hobby, it was medicine. With every shuffle and stomp, Miller was realigning her bones, rebuilding strength, training her body to defy the odds. By the time she reached her teens, she'd become a phenomenon. But the damage lingered. One leg remained weaker. She wore specially fitted shoes to support it, and off-screen, she struggled with balance and pain that she hid with obsessive discipline. She rarely let on that anything was wrong. The public saw dazzle and drive. Only those close to her saw the recovery that never truly ended. Miller performed through injuries and fatigue, keeping pace with choreography that would exhaust even the healthiest bodies. To the world, she was tireless. But behind every show-stopping number was a girl who'd once been told she might never walk, spinning so fast the pain could barely catch her. And while Ann Miller tapped away from her diagnosis, the next woman faced a slower battle, one fought not on stage but in hospitals, where every surgery felt like a countdown she refused to acknowledge. 19. Ingrid Bergman. Ingrid Bergman had the kind of face directors called luminous. She radiated sincerity, elegance, and intelligence in equal measure. But even legends bleed. In her final years, behind the cool composure and regal bearing, Bergman was enduring a painful, private war with breast cancer. She'd undergone a mastectomy and lymph node surgery, treatments that left her body bruised and her arm so swollen she had to sleep with it propped up. Still, she worked. In her final performance playing Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir in A Woman Called Golda, she raised that damaged arm with quiet defiance, an act of will disguised as acting. She never let on how much it cost her to perform. Audiences saw strength in her portrayal. What they didn't see was that she was physically deteriorating as the cameras rolled. Behind the scenes, she coped with exhaustion, pain, and the creeping limits of a body that had always obeyed her, until it didn't. But she never publicly complained. She remained graceful to the end, embodying the ideal of stoicism under pressure. Ingrid never asked for pity. She just asked for the next scene. And while her illness played out quietly, the next actress's fear wasn't of disease, but of the deep, black silence beneath the surface, where no spotlight could follow. 20. Natalie Wood. Natalie Wood grew up in front of the camera. Audiences watched her transform from precocious child star to luminous ingenue, as though her life unfolded entirely on screen. But what they didn't see, what the camera couldn't capture, was the undercurrent of fear that shaped nearly every step of her career. Wood harbored a paralyzing phobia of deep, dark water. It wasn't a quirk, it was a terror. And the worst part? Directors kept putting her in water anyway. In The Green Promise, a staged river scene went wrong, and she was swept away by a collapsing bridge. She was 10. Afterward, she did what stars were trained to do. She smiled and kept working. But the fear stayed. For the rest of her life, water represented danger, darkness, disappearance. Yet scripts kept demanding she wade in, swim, float, survive. And she did, barely, because fear wasn't allowed on camera. What viewers saw was serenity. What Natalie felt was panic. That private terror lent a strange fragility to her presence. Even at her most glamorous, there was always something haunted in her eyes. The kind of look you only get from pretending to be safe when you're not. And then, of course, came the irony. A life defined by fear of drowning, ending in water. But long before Natalie's story ended, another beauty was unraveling. This time not in water, but in silence, paranoia, and an unraveling mind Hollywood chose to ignore. 21. Veronica Lake. Veronica Lake's hair made her a legend. That iconic peekaboo wave turned her into a wartime fantasy, effortlessly cool, unattainable, and dripping with noir allure. But while Hollywood was obsessed with the image, it had no patience for the reality behind it. Lake's real life was messier, darker, and laced with battles she never fully won. In later interviews, she hinted at mental health struggles, often clouded in euphemism. Nerves, difficulties, restlessness. What those closest to her saw was more complicated. Paranoia, erratic mood swings, increasing isolation. Some accounts describe a diagnosis of schizophrenia, though no official confirmation ever emerged. What did emerge was a pattern of brilliance cut short, of opportunities vanished, of a woman retreating from a world that refused to accommodate her complexity. And then there was the drinking, the thing people talked about when they didn't want to talk about everything else. Lake's struggles with alcohol became the go-to explanation for her fading star, a convenient scapegoat for a system that offered no support for mental illness. By her 40s, she was working as a barmaid in a New York hotel, nearly unrecognizable to the same public that once adored her. But mental decay wasn't always fast or dramatic. For some, like the next actress, it arrived quietly, through muscle tremors, weakening limbs, and a body that refused to explain itself until it was too late. 22. Margaret Leighton. Margaret Leighton carried herself like royalty, elegant, composed, every syllable wrapped in precision. Whether on stage or in a period film, she was the picture of poise. But what audiences didn't see was that, in her final years, that poise was becoming harder and harder to sustain. Leighton was living with multiple sclerosis, a degenerative disease that slowly erodes the nervous system, taking strength, balance, and coordination along with it. She kept the diagnosis private for as long as possible. To the public, she was just slowing down. A little more tired, perhaps, a bit more selective with her roles. But in reality, every performance required extraordinary effort. Simple movements became calculated. Her stamina thinned. Scripts had to be rewritten to accommodate her limitations. Still, she refused to retreat. Even as the disease progressed, she remained on stage and screen, pushing through the pain and fatigue. There's something quietly tragic about an actress whose job is control, voice, movement, presence, losing that very control piece by piece. When she died in 1976, many were shocked to learn how far the disease had progressed. She'd hidden it well, perhaps too well, but not every illness waits for permission. The next actress was overtaken suddenly, her body ambushed by something growing in the shadows, just behind her eyes. 23. Susan Hayward. Susan Hayward had a fire in her, sharp, unsentimental, and almost immune to softness. She played tough women with complicated pasts, often channeling a kind of inner grit that seemed bottomless. But even the toughest are mortal. In the 1960s, Hayward was diagnosed with a malignant brain tumor. It didn't just threaten her life, it altered it, piece by piece. She began to experience dizziness, headaches, and speech issues. At first, they were brushed off as exhaustion or the strain of filming. But soon, the truth emerged. Her body was faltering, and the tumor was growing. She continued to act even as her energy waned, her memory blurred, and her movements became unsteady. There's something uniquely cruel about neurological illness in a performer. The very tools of the trade, voice, timing, expression, begin to short-circuit. But Hayward, stubborn to the end, pushed forward. She made public appearances, gave interviews, smiled for flashbulbs, even when she could barely stand without support. She never became the tragic tabloid figure. She kept the image intact, all while losing ground behind it. But while Susan's illness was a swift, private invasion, the next woman's battle played out slowly, publicly, and became a quiet turning point in how fans understood hidden disabilities. 24. Annette Funicello. Annette Funicello was America's sweetheart before America even knew it needed one. From Mouseketeer to beach movie queen, she was wholesome wrapped in glamour, safe wrapped in sunshine. But in the late 1980s, something began to shift. She lost her balance. Her hands trembled. She forgot lines. At first, fans chalked it up to aging, nerves, or the pressures of performing. But the truth was harder. Funicello had multiple sclerosis, and for years she kept it a secret. The tremors? Just a little clumsiness. The stiffness? A bad back. She wore wigs and leaned on furniture discreetly, anything to maintain the illusion. Because unlike many of her golden age peers, Annette had been branded as youthful forever. Aging was already a betrayal. Illness? Unthinkable. Eventually she went public, not with a tabloid leak, but with grace. She wanted to show people what MS looked like, to put a familiar, beloved face to a disease often misunderstood or ignored. It was an act of quiet rebellion against an industry that demands silence in the face of decline. She lived the rest of her life with dignity, slowly retreating from the public eye as the disease progressed. But there was one woman who never retreated, never slowed down, even as her lungs collapsed, her voice frayed, and her body disintegrated behind one final curtain. 25. Tallulah Bankhead. Tallulah Bankhead didn't just enter a room, she commandeered it. All smoky drawl and devastating wit, she was a walking headline, impossible to ignore and harder to contain. But behind the fire and fury was a body unraveling for decades. Bankhead lived with chronic lung disease, emphysema and bronchitis, that left her breathless long before the public saw her slowing down. Her voice, that famous husky weapon, became more strained with each passing year. In interviews, she made jokes about it. On stage, she powered through coughing fits with theatrical flair. It was easier to laugh than to admit she couldn't breathe. Her insomnia was legendary, and her dependence on pills to find rest only compounded the wear on her already fragile health. She aged fast, faster than her contemporaries, faster than the audience wanted to see, but she refused to disappear. Even in her final years, Bankhead kept up appearances, hosting talk shows, commanding stages, and draining rooms of air the moment she walked in. She was magnetic, messy, and mortal, but never meek. Tallulah burned at both ends, and when the end came, it was hardly a surprise. She had spent her life daring it to arrive, and just like that the curtain fell, not just on her, but on an era where silence was survival, and every spotlight came with shadows.